Hey friends, it's Simon Hurley and welcome to another video. Today I'm showing how to use solid stamps and a couple different creative techniques to get great results with them every single time. Without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so I'm starting off with the Owl Buddies stamp set, and I'm starting off using this large image on the left there. I love to incorporate some solid background images in my stamp sets like this, but I wanted to share exactly how to use them and several different ways to use them in today's video. So with this photopolymer type set, you want to peel that backing off kind of carefully, and the first time it's going to be a little bit more difficult than the rest, and then just peel off the background from the backing sheet. There we have our piece, and I'm going to then stick this background into my MISTI on a piece of my stark white cardstock right in the center. I'm going to share how to do this in the MISTI first, but if you don't have a MISTI stamping tool, at the end I'll share some different ways you can use it without the MISTI. This just ensures you can stamp it in the same place several times over and over. Then I'm going to go in with my Simon Hurley Create ink pad, so you can use any sort of inks here, and I'm just going to use my ink blending tools to dab on some color. This first application method takes a little bit more time, but you get a beautifully blended result in the end. I'm starting off with a little bit of Crown Me here and my domed foam blending tool, and I'm going to dab the color onto the surface. You can see that the first time you dab it on there, you're not getting like a full strength ink like you would just stamping the ink pad normally, but you're getting a nice feathered out edge which is going to easily blend into the other color. You can see I stamped it about 3 times here to get a nice solid dark background. Then I'm going in with a little bit of Love Struck, and here's another way to do it. You can start off by dipping your ink pad onto the stamp like this, like you would normally stamp it, and then feather out the edges with the blending tool. This is another way to do it to save a little bit of time if you don't want to continue adding the layers each time. So this gives a little bit more concentrated of a result right away. I still went in, I think about 2 times to make sure that this had a nice solid stamped result, and you also want to kind of feather it down into the purple and make sure those 2 colors blend together really beautifully so you get a nice blended and even background. Then I'm moving on to my next color. Here I'm using a little bit of Guppy to blend into the Love Struck there. And I'm again using the method to just apply it right from my blending tool like this. Now I also wanted to talk about using a blending brush versus a foam blending tool. Here I decided to use the Ranger Foam Dome blending tools because I find that these foam tools pick up a little bit more ink and apply a more solid application down. So it moves along the process a little bit easier. But by all means, if you have blending brushes in your stash, be sure to try those out as well. You just might have to do a couple more layers because I find blending brushes give a little bit of a softer result at the beginning, so you just might have to layer up the ink a little bit more, which is totally fine. Here I finished off the background with a couple layers of Shooting Star to build up the yellow there. That finishes it off so nicely, and I love how beautifully blended these colors are together by doing them in several layers on my MISTI like this. Then all I have to do to clean off my Simon Hurley Create inks is just use a little bit of water and wipe it off the surface. But of course you could use stamp cleaner too if your inks tend to stain. And there is my beautiful stamped background. Again, I just love how these colors blend together so seamlessly with the foam dauber tool. There are no harsh lines, and I think it's gorgeous. Then for this next one, I want to share a more simple technique, starting off by just stamping down the solid color. Here I'm going in with a little bit of Breakup Blue, which is a nice light blue color from my line, and I'm going to stamp it down in the MISTI tool again. Now this is one of those situations where you could just stamp it normally like a background stamp, but I wanted a couple different colors on here, and to make sure that it was perfectly solid and crisp, so I'm just going in and stamping it a second time to build up the color. I love how that looks. Now if I want to add a little bit more shading, I'm going to go in with a little bit of darker blue. Here I'm going in with no diving, and I'm again using it on my blending tool, the foam blending daubers here, and I'm just going to go right around the edges. Here, instead of doing stripes, I'm creating almost a vignette by adding a darker color around the edge. This creates a little bit of a lighter center, and it'll draw your eye into the center while creating a nice depth and dimension on the background. It's a technique I love to do to draw your eye to the center of the card. After doing about 2 layers of the no diving, I then came in with a little bit of Midnight Snack to finish it off. This is the darkest color blue that I'm using, and I'm just lightly tapping it right on the direct edge of the stamp to give it just a touch more dimension and shading. Again, using these blending tools is just going to create a little bit of a softer color than it usually would if you went direct to surface with the ink pad, but it's going to create a beautiful blend between all the different colors that is incredibly seamless. And here I think I did about 2 layers of it again, just because I wanted the full intensity of that ink color. Stamp it down, giving it good pressure, And there you can see that gives such a great look, and it adds so much depth and dimension. By doing those 3 colors in that circular motion there, it completes it off beautifully. Before we move into the next cards, I wanted to share how I finished these off using the Owl Buddy stamp set. So I went in with a couple of the focal point owls, and I'm just going to stamp those down on my stark white cardstock with a little bit of black VersaFine ink. Once I've stamped these guys down, I have a nice crisp image, and I'm going to go over top of it with a little bit of clear heat embossing powder. You guys know I have an obsession with heat embossing all of my black images. I find it makes them stand out nicely, but also here I'm going to be doing a little bit of watercoloring, and I find that adding that little bit of clear heat embossing almost creates a barrier that's going to help my colors stay inside of the lines and not bleed outside. It really is super helpful when you're doing any watercoloring. So once I've heat set that, I'm going to go in with my Simon Hurley Create ink pads and a couple different colors I want to use for the owls, and create a palette down onto my craft sheet here. I just swipe the ink down onto the surface, and then I can pick it up with a paintbrush and apply it to my cardstock. So whenever I'm watercoloring like this, I like to start off with just a normal paintbrush and add a layer of water down onto the surface of the image that I want to color. If you don't add this water down, I find that the color kind of sinks right in and doesn't really have a chance to move around. But here you can see I'm going in with my color, and it spreads nicely across the surface and gives a nice smooth, even layer since the paper was already saturated with water to start with. Then once I've added down this first layer of color, I can then go in with the same color, but with a little bit less water to add some shading. I shade down wherever there are areas where the body meets, so you can see the head meets. I want to add a little bit of shading there, and also onto the wings as well. You can see the shading just kind of adds a little bit of depth and dimension and really brings the image to life. Then I'm going to do the same thing with his head, but I work in little sections like this so that the layer of water doesn't dry completely before I move on to the next section. I find that this water layer is incredibly helpful with blending, so you want to make sure it's still wet before you move on in with your color. I also want to mention that I'm just using a regular paintbrush here. I love these little Ranger artist brushes because they're pretty inexpensive and they come in lots of different sizes in a pack. The reason why I just use a regular paintbrush and pick up my water instead of using a water brush is because I find you get a lot more control when you're watercoloring, and I tend to not use as much water as a water brush would put out. So here you have a lot of control with how your watercoloring is going to turn out and how much water you add onto the surface when you're adding your shading in. Here I'm moving on into the gray owl. I've added down a light layer of gray, and then I'm going to darken it up by using a little bit less water and adding the same color down in some areas where I want the shading. Then to bring a little bit of warmth in, I went in with some Over the Moon and added it down onto there as well to give a nice warm yellow color to his stomach. That finishes off these owls really nicely. They're very simple to color in, and once they're all dry, I can go in with my scissors and fussy cut these out. I like to leave a little bit of a white border all the way around to make it stand out from the background, and I'm using my Fiskars Spring Assist scissors to easily cut these out with a smooth finish. Once I'm done fussy cutting, I can put all my cards together. I added a little bit of foam tape behind the owl, and I'm adhering him down onto the colorful stamped background. Then for the sentiment, I'm going to use the sentiment that says "You're a hoot," and I'll stamp that down onto some black cardstock. Once I've stamped that down, I can throw over a layer of white heat embossing powder and heat set it until it's nice and shiny. I love the contrast that the white heat embossing has onto the black cardstock, and when I've adhered it all together, that card is just beautiful. The background stamping is so nice and blended and super solid, and I love how the owl looks on top. Then to finish off this next card, I'm adding that gray owl down on some foam tape, make him look like he's flying through the sky, and finish it off with the sentiment that says, "I will see you soon." Again, a beautifully stamped background, and I love how this one is shaded on the edges so it draws your eye into the center of the card. For the next cards, I'm using the Bold Bouquet stamp set. I love this one and all those beautiful flower backgrounds in it, and it's got another really bold image in it that I'm going to share how to stamp in today's video with a couple more techniques. I'm going to peel this one off the back guard the same way. This one's been used a couple times, so it's really easy to get off. Then I'm going to use my Stick and Stamp mat from Brutus Monroe. I love this guy because you can easily stick down your cardstock and use it in your MISTI without having to use any magnets. This is super helpful when you're using a background like this one from the Bold Bouquet stamp set that covers the whole card front, so there's no room for any magnets. For this first background, I'm going to share kind of an abstract inking technique to get more of a color blocked look on your solid stamps. So I'm starting off with a little bit of slippery and wet, and I'm going to take my ink pad and just ink it up in 2 to 3 areas starting off of the edge of the stamp here. Then I'll move in with the next color. Here I'm using a little bit of Prom Queen, and again, I'm working in my way from the edge and stamping kind of color blocked areas. You don't want to move around your ink pad too much because you want it to be kind of a solid rectangle of color. So when I'm inking, I just kind of move my ink pad up and down in the same spot, or you just add lots of pressure down to make sure that it fills in that solid gap there. And wherever the ink pads overlap, you want to make sure you're using colors that are going to work together. So that pink and yellow is going to make a nice orange. This burgundy color called Game Over is going to be a nice contrast and dark color for it. So again, I'm just bringing in this color in several little areas. You can make it kind of overlap other colors. And then I'm going to go in with a little bit of Roar to fill in some of the open areas with the rest of this orange. Don't worry about being too perfect because we can always fix some of these littler mistakes in just a little bit once we do our first stamping. This is why we keep it in the MISTI stamping tool. So I'm going to stamp down this background, give it some good pressure all the way around, and you can use your little pressure tool here too. I find this to be super helpful to make sure I get a great impression on my stamped images. Once that's all stamped, you can see it gave a nice crisp result, but you can see that there's some little white areas where it didn't stamp perfectly. In that case, I can go back in with the exact color and target different areas that I want to stamp. And if you don't want it to be full intensity, you can always go in with your blending tools again and kind of spot treat those areas. Also, I wanted to add more color blocking in some areas. So here I went in with a little bit of Game Over, and you can add another layer of color blocking. This is a great way to add more color in if you were too overwhelmed the first time, and now you can kind of take a step back and see which areas need a little bit more color. I added Game Over in 2 different areas, and I found that it really completed the background nicely. So once that's all stamped, you can pull it off the British Monroe Stick and Stamp mat by bending the mat, and there we have our beautiful background. And as those inks kind of dry, they're going to merge together a little bit more, but I love the color blocked and bold effect. Then I'm going to go in with my Tim Holtz mini guillotine trimmer. I love to keep this one on my desk because it's super handy, and I'm just going to go in and cut this down so that it has a nice white border all around my card. Then I'm going to cut down a piece of black cardstock to have just a tiny little border right around this colored piece. I find that it gives a little bit of contrast, which I think is beautiful. So once that's all done, I can then find a sentiment that I want to use. I love this lovely Lantanas stamp set, and this sentiment that says "You are so much stronger than you think" is so nice and encouraging. I'm going to stamp that down in some Versamark clear sticky ink onto my black cardstock, and then I'm going to throw over a layer of white heat embossing powder again. Now, one tip that I have lately that I've been doing is I bring it kind of close to me and I lightly blow over top of it. This is just going to make sure that any excess white embossing powder comes off without flicking it off to get too much off the surface. Then I'm going to go in with my Fiskars Spring Assist scissors. I love these guys because they spring back out at you so your hands won't get tired, and they've got a nice fine point so they can get into the details. I like to fussy cut out my sentiments, leaving a little bit of a border around it, but this kind of helps implement it into the card and show more of the background without leaving just a big rectangle around your sentiment. I love how this one turned out, keeping it super simple and letting that bold and colorful background really stand out and shine. This would also be a great technique to use with mini ink pads too. Now, as I promised, I wanted to share a couple different techniques to stamp these solid stamps without having to have a MISTI on hand. I'm going to take my bold bouquet background stamp and place it down onto my work surface or craft sheet. Then I'm going to use it kind of facing upward like this, just like I would a background stamp. No acrylic block needed. Now I'm going to show you 2 different attempts or methods to do this sort of stamping technique. For this first one, I'm going to create kind of a gradient of pink colors getting darker at the bottom. So I'm starting off with a little bit of rosy cheeks, moving into Love Struck, and then I'll finish it off with some Game Over. You can see as I ink this stamp up, there are kind of some lines in between that have harsh edges. So then I'm going to go in with a blending brush. This is a great way to blend the color together just by tapping your brush onto the surface in between those lines. The reason I love the brush for this method is because it's not going to absorb your ink in this area or take it off, but it's just going to kind of help blend it together. So I love the brush for this instance. Then I'm going to go in and spray it down with water. Now this is what separated both of the 2 techniques I'm going to share with you. The water kind of gives it a more blotchy watercolor technique. You can see I'm going to then press it down and use my hands to smooth it out to get a nice impression. Here is the result I got. Not super ideal, but I did like it. I loved the color on the background that it gives, and I liked the little bit of white space that it left, but it kind of muddied up the image and didn't leave me with a smooth impression. Not to fear though, because this stamp set actually has the reverse of this image, which is going to give you the outlined look, which I love. It was designed so you can use this background in kind of an abstract way like this, and then reline it up and create almost a 2-toned effect. I dried that really nicely to do the rest of my stamping, and then I'm going to line up the outline image with my MISTI stamping tool. Again, I am playing on my MISTI, but to line this up perfectly I wanted to, but you could just use an acrylic block. Then I'm going to ink this up using a little bit of that VersaFine black ink to get a really nice crisp image over top of this background. Once I've inked that up, I can then just use my MISTI stamping tool to stamp it down. Now this is why I have it in here and why I love this tool, because I can go over it several times if I need to, and because it's kind of a large background, I wanted to make sure that I got a nice crisp impression. So I inked it up again and stamped it in the exact same spot. Again, the stick and stamp mat came in really handy here because I didn't have to use a magnet to hold it down, and this background stamp covers most of the card. Then I'm going in with a layer of clear heat embossing powder for no other reason than I just love how nice and bold the clear heat embossing powder makes it and the nice finished shine that it gives on the card. Then I'm going to heat set that until it's clear and shiny, and you can see just how bold and nice that black image becomes because that clear shine really finishes it off. Then I'm going to finish off the background by adding another kind of vignette look. Again, I love to add this darker color around the edge, so I went in with the exact same ink colors that I used for the stamping, except here I'm applying them down with a little bit of ink blending on my foam applicator tools. By going around the edge and applying that same color, it adds a little bit of darkness to the edge, but it keeps it in the exact same color palette that we used for the stamping. Again, this is just going to darken up those flowers around the edge and draw our eye to the center where we're going to have the sentiment. I think it finishes off beautifully and adds a nice solid color and detail to the background. To finish this one off, I went again in with the same little mini guillotine trimmer, and I'm just going to cut this right down around the stamped image that we created to fit nicely with a border onto our A2 size card. Then I'll adhere that down onto the card with a little bit of tape runner, and you can see that nice white border adds a lot of contrast against all of the color that we added down. Once that's all down, I'm going to finish it off with my sentiment. I wanted to show that I'm using the alcohol ink black cardstock for my sentiments. Whenever I want something that's going to really stand out and give me a nice look, I go for this because it's a super crisp black, and it's also got this cool kind of velvety feel to it. So I use it for things like sentiments and anything that's kind of stand out on the card. So here I just used the thank you sentiment from the Bold Bouquet stamp set. I love the different sentiment options that are in that set. You have a lot of choices, but I went with something super basic. Then I'm going to throw over a layer of my white heat embossing powder, and again I'm going to use that trick where I kind of blow off any of the excess. That's been really helping to get a nice crisp and clean embossed look without losing any of the detail there. I'll heat emboss that and then add it down into the card in the center to finish it off really nicely. The detailed image looks great on top of this watercolor background, and I love the ink blending that we added to the edges to finish it off. Then for the next card, I'm going to do this same ink applying technique. I'm going to use those same three colors, Rosy Cheeks, Love Struck, and Game Over, and apply them down onto the surface of my stamp here. Now, like I said, you could use an acrylic block, but I like to stamp these sort of stamps like I would a background, just face up on my surface and press my cardstock into it. For some reason, I find I can apply a better pressure than using a large acrylic block. Once I've had that done, I'm going to then go in with the same blending tool and just dab right in between to make sure that I get a nice blending in between the colors. This is an incredibly helpful step to get a great blend. Then I'm going to take my stark white cardstock and apply it down onto the surface there and give some good pressure onto the top. You can either use your fingers or use a pressure tool like this one, but you can tell with this technique I didn't apply any water because I wanted to keep all the detail and get a nice smooth impression. And you can see once I finish that off, you get a beautiful stamped image, a nice smooth impression over the top of the whole background. So if you want to, that's a great technique to stamp down the whole background and get a nice solid look. Alright guys, I hope you really enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up and leave me a comment down below which card was your favorite. Also down in the description box is the full supplies list for everything that I used, and those links help support me, so I really appreciate you using them. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!